This video is a conversation I had with Josie Kinz, who has been involved with numerous projects within the psychedelic community, but she's most commonly known, firstly for being the co-founder of Psychedelic Wiki, also the founder of the website Subjective Effects Index, and also the Replications subreddit. So I think a good preamble here to this conversation would be to explain what we mean by things like subjective effects and replications. Subjective effects, in terms of psychedelics, are the various recognisable changes in state, which can be anything from like tracer-style visual effects during a light trip through to this all-encompassing reality replacement and the presence of seemingly intelligent and godlike entities, the kind of thing that you get within a DMT breakthrough. And Josie's work attempts to catalogue these effects into a common linguistic framework. And replications are video clips, which most of us will have seen online, and they kind of attempt to simulate these subjective effects into a visual form. Now, often this is like as a piece of motion art, which we recognise as a representation or replication of what we see during a trip. Now, if you've watched one of my trip report videos, then you've probably seen such work, because I tend to use it as the backdrop to my storytelling. And the Replications subreddit, which Josie founded, is a superb resource for finding this kind of artwork. So I wanted to talk to Josie because I tend to look at these experiences as a kind of singular narrative story with a collective meaning, rather than as separate effects. So I was interested to get her perspective on how she approaches this space. Also, I'm kind of fascinated by people who can recollect these experiences so objectively and accurately document what they've gone through. Because I'm usually just on the floor, mouth agape, saying, "What the fuck?" and then all the details just like vanish into the ether. Anyway, I'll leave some links in the description below to Josie's various websites and also her YouTube channel, which she's recently started, where she really breaks these topics down, so go and check that out. And without further ado, I bring you Josie Kinz.
So, I'm here with Josie Kinz, a fellow psychonaut, host of the YouTube channel of the same name, and like myself, a fellow traitor to the Crown Monarchy of England. What was it that caused you to abandon our beautiful shores?
It's a long and complicated story that I probably shouldn't get into all of the details of, but I pretty much met a gal and ended up moving to America back in 2016.
Oh, and has that worked out for you? Is it all good on the other side of the pond?
It's all right. It's a trade-off for sure. I miss England sometimes, but I usually hate it when I go home. So
yeah, I'm the same. I think the thing I miss most is the sense of humour and just people being able to understand the kind of speech mannerisms. Because yeah, just where I live in Europe, I live in Switzerland, and just nobody's got a sense of humour here at all. They just do not get me. So that's one thing I like when I go back home to Manchester, just to sort of be able to talk normally and have people get me. So, but you were from Hastings, is that right?
Yeah, I'm originally from Hastings, East Sussex, which is just a standard shitty little seaside town. I love it, but I have very mixed feelings about it.
Hastings is not so bad. I've spent some time there because I used to go to the summer solstice at Stonehenge every year. So I'd go down there because that was the only time of year where you could actually get up to Stonehenge. And we'd go there and just take loads of psychedelics and just trip out all night. And then after there, we would sort of move down the coast and just like go camping along the coast. And we'd always end up in places like Brighton and Hastings and so. So I have been in your hometown, and it's quite a nice place, I thought.
I think I have an inherent bias due to the experiences I've had there more so than anything. It's probably fine.
So yeah, I mean, a lot of things I'd like to sort of to get into with you. I just wanted to check something because I've got a sneaky suspicion. I've been stalking a few of your various social profiles, and I think we might have a mutual love of the cartoon Adventure Time. Would I?
Oh, really?
Correct? Which is why I have worn my special Adventure Time psychedelic T-shirt.
Oh, that's pretty fucking cool. Yeah, I love Adventure Time. It's probably my favorite show of all time. Why did you even? I'm not even aware of mentioning it on any of my social media. I guess I probably have a lot of stalking content, but
I've done some pretty deep stalking. So it was actually it didn't take that much effort. It was on your Psychonaut Wiki profile, and on the founders pages, I noticed that yourself and the other sort of founders tended to lean towards Adventure Time characters as kind of avatars. So one of you had Flame Princess, one of you had Marceline. And so, yeah, I thought, okay, there's a thing here. I'll test them because I absolutely love Adventure Time. I think it's just the greatest psychedelic cartoon by far. And yeah, so I just thought I'd see it. In fact, I'm even drinking out of my Marceline the Vampire Queen.
Oh, I can't see it because it's blurring out. But yeah, Adventure Time has always been a bit of an obsession of mine. It's probably my favorite show of all time. I've had a lot of good trips and a lot of bad trips to it.
Yeah, I had some. Yeah. I think one of my last time I did LSD. I've not done LSD like much since I really started getting into psychedelics. I did it a lot when I was younger, and then the last time I had it, it just completely kicked my ass. And I'd turned the TV on, and this was the first time I ever saw Adventure Time, and it was the first Nightosphere episode, the one with Marceline's dad.
I love that episode.
It's so good. But I was watching it, and it starts off, it's just kind of normalish, and then when he sort of appears through the portal and starts sucking everyone's souls out, and then the LSD just kicked in, it started melting out of the TV, and I was like, fuck, what's going on?
Yeah, I have a lot of experiences watching that show while tripping, and every now and then I'll come across what seems to be a cursed episode in which something suspicious is afoot, and I will usually slip into some kind of delusion and have some kind of an outburst. It's happened so many times now.
Well, there's a lot there to work with, and I think there's so much depth to some of the episodes, especially in the later series where it starts going into stuff with like Prismo and the alternate dimensions and all the stuff around kind of Finn being reincarnated and stuff. I saw a lot of parallels in there from my own kind of like DMT experiences that I'm surprised it's not more revered as just like one of the most sort of psychedelic things ever, because it's got that psychedelic as well as the psychedelic visual. It's got the psychedelic kind of heart and narrative to it as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I suppose since Pendleton Ward put out the Midnight Gospel, it's become pretty undeniable that Adventure Time was at least partially inspired by a lot of psychedelic usage, I would suppose.
Yeah. And what did you think of that, the Midnight Gospel?
It was incredible, and I cried a lot at the last episode because it was just very, very, very relatable themes for me. In fact, I'm glad I didn't go into that episode without warning as to what the content of the episode was while tripping, because I had been saving it for a long time, and then a friend warned me, and it was very emotional.
Yeah, the last episode
that show affected me a lot.
Yeah, it's the last one's beautiful. I mean, I had a similar sort of emotional effect because I also lost my mother, and yeah, I wasn't too into the series at first at all. I watched like the first 4 or 5 episodes, and I think it's because I was expecting something more, much more narrative driven, like Adventure Time, and so it just didn't click with me at all. But the last one definitely sort of makes up for it. But I would have preferred to see. You know all the stuff at the beginning where all the kind of the reality simulation stuff before he actually goes into it. I would have preferred to see more of this and the relationship he had with his sort of relatives and all the stuff kind of outside of the simulation. I thought was a bit more interesting than the stuff inside, which is a bit too random for me.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I could definitely see that. It's no replacement for Adventure Time for sure.
Yeah, well, I think that one's pretty much unreplaceable just because the amount of heart in it. But anyway, enough about Adventure. Let's get to talk about some of your different sort of projects, because yeah, I mean, you've had your hand in so many things over the years, and I think probably many psychonauts out there will have likely Googled and come across something you've been involved with without actually realizing it. So I mean, just to reel a few off, you were one of the co-founders of the Psychonaut Wiki, the founder of the Replications subreddit. You did your own sort of website, Disregard Everything I Say. Got which I think is your current project, the Subjective Effect Index, and you've now recently started doing your own YouTube channel. So have I missed anything out there?
I think that just about covers everything.
That's a lot.
It wasn't quite in that order, but yeah, those are the various projects that I've been in that I founded over the years.
So what is it what kind of drives you to do it? Because I think there's a common theme here across all these projects, which seems to be like a drive to catalog effects. Would you say that's accurate?
So when I was a teenager at the age of 17, I originally started getting quite heavily involved and obsessed with psychedelics, and I realized that there wasn't any formal, rational documentation on the subjective effects that psychedelic substances induce. And I was also listening to a lot of Terence McKenna at the time, and I recall him saying in a particular lecture that we're not going to understand the psychedelic experience until we map it out. So at the time, I assumed that somebody had already done that and spent quite a lot of time looking for such a project, but I couldn't seem to find one, and that confused me. So despite my lack of any sort of formal academic background, I kind of just set out to do it myself, and that was when I was a teenager. It originally started with the blog disregardeverythingisay.com. I called it that because I knew that I wasn't an expert in anything, and it was essentially a disclaimer that gave me a sort of intellectual freedom where if I did get something wrong, I could be, well, the site's called disregardeverythingisay.com. But that sort of took off to a surprising extent, particularly on Reddit and the R-Drugs subreddit, like way back in, geez, it must have been 2012 or 2013. It was over a decade ago at this point. And I essentially used that blog to catalog the subjective effects of not just psychedelics, but hallucinogens in general. I was trying to devise what I've called the subjective effect index, where I break the individual subcomponents of a hallucinogenic experience into different effects and categories with leveling systems and style variations and formal descriptions, as well as accompanying replications. And that's essentially the gist of it. That originally started on a Tumblr blog, and I felt that it had outgrown the confines of what a Tumblr blog could do for such a project. So I eventually founded Psychonaut Wiki and started putting up the subjective effect index on that. And Psychonaut Wiki I originally founded as essentially a means to legitimize and popularize the subjective effect index, but it sort of branched out and went in a different direction and became just a generalized encyclopedia for substance information in general. Which was good, and I focused on that project for a few years before eventually realizing that I wanted to focus more exclusively on subjective effect documentation as a sort of formalized field of phenomenology. So I left that project and founded effectindex.com, which is where I've been for the past few years. Somewhere in the mix, our Replications subreddit got founded, but the timeline is messy in my head.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on there. You're very sort of busy. So what is it that kind of sort of captures your interest so much about the subjective effects, so, as opposed to, say, like kind of like the narrative part, or, you know, the catching the trip reports, or the meaning, or exploring the other aspects? You see, what is it that makes you zero in on that subjective effect aspect?
Let me have a think about that. Well, my original primary motivating factor was simply that these were very profound and important experiences, but they hadn't been documented beyond metaphors and analogies and disparate trip reports. So I felt that in order to come to a better universal understanding of these experiences, that we needed a terminology set that was useful for both the average person and scientific researchers in order to discuss and describe the experiences. So I just essentially set out to create that terminology set, and it kind of expanded into, I think it's over 200 individual subjective effect components at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you've covered a lot as well. I mean, just from your last few videos, you've covered the more kind of visual element, the kind of subjective element, and also I think your most recent video was around the what you refer to as like autonomous entities, so the classic sort of, you know, what some people call like machine elves and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, is there anything else that you would sort of look to catalog within that, or?
Do you mean within the YouTube channel specifically?
Just like, I'm just wondering sort of where the kind of the boundaries of your interest are, because I think for a lot of people with these kind of experiences, you know, there's this kind of like a spectrum of how people view these things, for everything from the very deeply spiritual, where it's, yeah, I mean, how would you even describe that without using the word spiritual or going to sort of like very woo-woo terms? There's people who look at it as very sort of like psychological or sort of narrative sort of driven. And then I'm just kind of interested in as to like, I mean, do you see these same kind of like, or value these kind of the narratives of the experience, or for you is the interest purely in just the effects that are being created as you go through the sort of psychedelic experience?
In regards to the spiritual stuff, I definitely have put a lot of effort into documenting what I would call the cognitive transpersonal states that can occur under the influence of psychedelics, and to a lesser extent the other hallucinogenic classes, particularly spirituality enhancement, unity and interconnectedness, existential self-realization, and I do find those incredibly fascinating, but I've always tried to strike a balance between getting carried away into pseudoscience and mysticism while also trying to comprehensively document them in a rational manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think the bit where spirituality kind of like bleeds over, I think people have a trouble kind of separating out the objective from the subjective. So the way I always kind of think of it is that if someone's having a subjective experience and they say, well, I thought this or I thought that, then it's fine. Like you go for it and interpret it the way you want. But then when someone starts using that to start making claims around objective reality, like, you know, in the case of people who, you know, start proclaiming that they can do sort of miracles or other reality bending things, then that's where I start kind of like, oh, okay, guy, you know, try to dial it down, dial down the bullshit a little bit. But still, I think the kind of like the spiritual experience and all that, the mystical experience, I think is fascinating in its own right as a kind of a subset of these experiences. And that's what I liked about the stuff that you do. You tend to have these kind of sliding scales of what sort of happens at each point, and the depth at which you go into explain that is pretty impressive to us, because I tend to come back like more like, what the fuck just happened, rather than being able to say, quick.
I mean, I do that too.
So how do you go about cataloging this stuff? Is it more that you kind of reflect on it afterwards, or are you conscious, like taking psychedelics to then catalog it, like pen in hand, sort of?
It's a little bit of both, to be honest. A lot of the individual effect components arise organically. I might hear about them from a friend saying, "Hey, I can't find this experience within the subjective effect index," or it may just come to me during a trip. I wouldn't say that there's any specific one technique that I've used, but I started by trying to split the psychedelic experience up into different overarching categories, such as visual effects, cognitive effects, physical effects, various other sensory effects, and then breaking those down further into categories such as amplifications, suppressions, distortions, just varying other subcategories. And from there, you can kind of just pinpoint individual experiences and document what it's like to undergo them.
Can I just ask one little thing? It's just nothing to worry about. But every time you're banging on the counter, we get a big sort of like boom through
the. My apologies. I'm very.
No, it's fine. I'm the same. I'm always very animated as well. But it's a very reverberating desk you've got there. It's like a boombox type thing. But I'm sure the viewers won't mind. They'll be fine. So yeah, I mean, one thing that kind of like jumps out to me with all the kind of like the stuff that you use in your videos, all the kind of like the visionary art and the sort of the media clips that have been done. It's really just how much the technology has like caught up to make it possible to sort of realize these kind of visionary states in these world. And it kind of reminds me of, you know, when stuff that I grew up with when I used to watch sort of films which would like trippy, and the classic ones like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and just what that could look like now if it was like remade using some of this technology, because some of them are amazingly good. Like when I think some of the effects that you described as like as flowing or melting and stuff like that, it really the ability to capture that is so close to the actual experience. It's yeah, I mean, it's just pretty amazing. Is that something you sort of think would you sort of mirror that the technology is sort of caught up to being able to mimic the psychedelic there?
It's definitely getting there. The technology has reached a point where the low-level effects are genuinely completely replicatable. All of the visual distortions and visual amplifications are genuinely replicatable with technology that's pretty available to the general public using video editors primarily such as After Effects. The higher level stuff, I believe that we do have the technology to replicate it, but it's more of a resources and budget issue. In terms of the replication community, there's constant progress being made, but I think in order to get to a point where high-level geometry and autonomous entities and hallucinatory states are genuinely replicated with complete accuracy, it's going to take something. It's going to take a very high budget, like the sort of thing you would see in a Hollywood movie. But I believe it will get there eventually.
Do you think the thing I kind of wonder about this is by the time you get to that kind of state within a sort of psychedelic state, it's not something that you're experiencing visually anymore at that point. You're kind of experiencing it just like a conscious state. And I've sort of wondered, is this something where it would be, is it just a case of VR? Would that be able to do it? But I'm not sure it is. I think the point at which you have these kind of breakthroughs, it seems like it's happening in another sense. It really is an altered state rather than sort of a visual state at that point. So I don't know if anything will ever come close to being able to capture that bonkers sort of experience without some sort of direct brain stimulation.
There's always going to be certain aspects of it that are impossible for example, when you experience high-level geometry, the complex forms that it manifests into often feel as if they represent kind of innately readable concepts of various sorts, and that's an experience where your visual perception is directly interfacing with your cognitive thought process, and that simply could not be replicated on a screen. You would need technology that's science fiction stuff in comparison to what we have now. I think that shouldn't necessarily be the goal. Replications seem to be a form of communication in which we can just show the general public how these experiences tend to look to kind of dispel misconceptions and such. But I think it's an interesting mix of art and phenomenology. I'm not a replicator myself, but I find it really fascinating watching the replication community progress over the years.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting to be able to show somebody things, but what I see value in from the replication community is just it's more of the expression of what the replicators themselves, that they're trying to capture that sort of that fire, that lightning in a bottle sort of thing. And most of us, when we do something like that, like try and capture psychedelic experience, and the first thing we'll always say is, and this is absolutely nothing like it. It's not even close to it, but this is it somehow. And yeah, even with some of the artwork which people have created, which some of the stuff on the replication subreddit, which is just incredible. I'm in awe of how some of these people put these things together, and still it's kind of like it's nowhere close, even in its most beautiful like form, where you just kind of your jaw just hits the floor. I'm not sure if we'll ever get there, because when you were talking about like complex geometry, I think one of the things within the psychedelic community is like it's geometry which then starts breeding further geometry, and the geometry itself is alive, which sings into life some more geometry, which itself, and everything's always happening in like tandem across multiple universes, but all at the same time. Like how that could be, like even in VR, I don't think it could ever be replicated.
I don't think it could fully either. I think you could create a representation that's very close. But I don't think you could replicate the more complex, multi-sensory cognitive aspects with current technology.
Yeah, have you seen any sort of particular like VR technologies which you think have done a good job of it?
The closest we have is a particular artist called Symmetric Vision, who's been very active within the replication community for the past several years. He is what I would consider the most talented replicator in the community, and his stuff comes very close. It's never quite there, but that's more it's more a limitation of the technology, and it's constantly getting closer.
Yeah, symmetric vision stuff is stunningly good. I think I've used it a couple of times in my own videos, and I mean, I've got to tip my hat to everybody in that community. I mean, there's just so many sort of talented artists who again, I wouldn't even be able to sort of put pen to paper and even Scrabble, come up with anything even close, and yet these people sort of replicate it so well in these kind of 3D worlds, and then make these clips for people like myself to then be able to go and use within my own sort of narrative thing. So I think it's such a sort of just a great resource. But yeah, I mean, I think there was one which I've been trying to get hold of, but it was coming back to sort of Pendleton Ward. He mentioned that there was some kind of VR thing that he was using where it kind of started creating objects from sound. And I think he talked about this on one of the Duncan Trussell podcasts, where that you put the VR headset on and it's with a kind of mic built into it. And as you start making voices, it kind of visualizes the sort of the sound waves. And he did this anecdote, like he hit a particular note, and this what would appear to be an autonomous entity like manifested in front of him and started communicating. And as long as he held the note, this thing would talk about him. I'll have to try.
I'll need to check that out.
Yeah. It was. I kept meaning, I've got to check out this piece of software because it sounds just incredible. But it was very sort of Terence McKenna-esque in the way he described it. Like this is how things will communicate. Like whatever the entities are, they will communicate with us via the technology that we have. So that was a cool thing. So I mean, it's apart from sort of symmetric visions, is there any other sort of replicators? If there's any of the audience who are not sort of familiar with the replication subreddit, is there any others that you would class as like a personal favorite or?
There are a lot of replicators that I would recommend. For example, Wes Swade, Oracle, and Misery. But there's also a lot of visionary artists that are active within the community, such as Hypnagogic and Sunterry Art. There seems to be a fine line between visionary art and a replication, and it often largely depends on the context in which it's used in.
Where would you like draw that line then? I think like most people are familiar with stuff like Alex Gray's thing, which I think probably does straddle that line, because it's definitely art in that it's trying to convey some kind of meaning, but it is a pretty good replication in some cases of what's going on.
Yeah, so I would say that in regards to visionary art, it really depends on the context that it's being used in. So a lot of visionary artists seem to create things that are inspired by their trips, but aren't necessarily direct replications of things that they have seen personally. And I feel that you can draw from that genre of art and use it as a representation of a subjective effect. And when it's used in that context, it is a replication. But if it's not being used in that context, I would categorize it more as visionary art. But it's definitely a very fuzzy line, and there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah, for sure. And you just mentioned Hypnagogic, and that's I've got to say one of my. I think that was one of the first kind of visual clip packs that I bought was from Hypnagogic to use in one of it, because I hope I'm not mixing the work up, but I think it does a lot of stuff with very DMT-esque psychedelic playground, fairgroundy type stuff.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, it's very. If it's what I'm thinking of, I use it a lot as it's kind of an entranceway into a kind of psychedelic theme park, which actually just perfectly lined up with what my first experiences with DMT, where I would always end up in some kind of theme park carnival type thing. So when I saw Hypnagogic stuff, I was like, I have got to use this. It's such a great bit of work. And yeah, I'm always, like I said, just an absolute sort of awe of people who capture these things, because I think you have to be so creative and a kind of like a master of these kind of software tools to be able to start realizing this stuff. I think in a lot of cases it's kind of like 3D sort of rendering software to do it. So it's it's not easy stuff to come up with, but again, these guys just do it amazingly.
Yeah, it definitely requires a lot of talent. In regards to distortions, I think it's usually done via video editing, and then the high level states seem to require 3D modeling. One interesting avenue that we're exploring is training neural networks on large data sets of visionary artwork in order to essentially force machine learning to generate psychedelic visuals. And we've been having some luck with that, but it definitely needs. It's still in its early stages.
Is that your own sort of piece of software you're developing there? Or?
It's not something. I am not a software developer at all, but neural networks are being used to generate lots of different types of artwork right now in a lot of different communities. It's typically referred to as generative art, and our community has been putting one together by training it on a data set of visionary artwork, and it's been achieving some very interesting results.
Is that like the same kind of thing as like Deep Dream? Is it
essentially, yes. I used an example of it in the latter part of the geometry video during the personal commentary section.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the effects of this, what I was referring to earlier, with that how like the technology's caught up, because especially in those kind of, I think what you just described as like the lower level effects, the things where it's, you know, things are phasing sort of backwards and forwards a little bit, or doing the kind of the swirly flowing stuff. That is, yeah, it one of those things where when you watch it, it's just like, that is so exactly, particularly for anyone who's done sort of DMT, and if you've done the kind of you know, things like the 3-hit method, and as you go into the experience, it just, you get those kind of replicated effects so distinctly that it's yeah, I mean, it's really just sort of pleasing to see people sort of capture it. So I just wanted to ask a little bit around your own sort of personal experiences. So what do you think? What's your take on the psychedelic experience? What do you think sort of going on here?
In terms of what's going on from a neurological standpoint,
I guess just what does it mean to you? Like,
I definitely think that the psychedelic experience is very significant, and I think it's very powerful and would probably benefit society if even a somewhat larger percentage of the population tripped. But for me, it's really just kind of a neurological doorway into an inner space, and I feel that it would be a tragedy if I didn't have access to those experiences, and if other people did not have access to those experiences. It's very meaningful to me, although I tend to trip much less these days.
Mm-hmm.
It's been incredibly profound for me from an introspective and a therapeutic perspective. I don't think that I would be anywhere near as psychologically stable as I am today without the help of psychedelic substances.
So would you kind of like subscribe more to the kind of, is it like a kind of Jungian perspective that you have in it? This kind of that what is taking place is an inward journey through your own psyche. I guess I'm trying to sort of pin down, like, is it like, but are you opening portals to the fifth dimension in your brain?
I don't personally believe that psychedelics open portals to the fifth dimension. I'm very much a
heresy.
Yeah, I'm very much a scientific materialist when it comes to the psychedelic experience. I believe that there are neurological explanations for each of the subjective effects, and to me that doesn't lessen how profound the experience is. If anything, I find it more profound that my brain is capable of generating such experiences on its own.
But what does that sort of leave you in terms of like the meaning aspects? Is it do you ever sort of get sort of sucked into the whole kind of like that there is a deeper meaning to this, or that there is some sort of grand narrative that is encoded within these substances, or is it all just purely within Josie Kinz?
I mean, I wouldn't. By Josie Kinz, I assume you mean me or people's brains in general. I definitely think that they're
a purely personal sort of thing. Like I think that the very reductionist version would say, oh, it's just drugs on your brain. You're just getting high. There's that sort of it, and then a sort of, again, there's like a kind of a scale here of where you could work along from that kind of reductionist view through to a full-blown woo-woo view. And I think, like, sort of personally, I don't know. I guess I'm probably somewhere in the middle, in where I personally don't particularly care what the sort of the root cause of the effect is. I put, as long as the experience itself is primary, and I know that I'm having an experience, and beyond that, I don't really give much of a shit. But I do attribute a lot of kind of meaning and personal meaning to it, just in the same way as that you could have, you could say that, love is a neurological, thing, which I'm not entirely sure if it is or not, but
doesn't make it less meaningful though, right?
Yeah, exactly. You could say that whatever feelings I have towards my wife and children are just, could be just hormones within my body or whatever, but that it doesn't, there is a human narrative there, I think. So, but again, some people just kind of would ignore even that and just say, well, no, it's just getting high. So I'm just kind of wondering
I definitely think that it's a incredibly meaningful experience, even if it is just a product of the human brain. I think the way that psychedelics can strip away cultural biases and illusions that we have built up over time is incredibly important, particularly when it comes to specific transpersonal effects such as unity and interconnectedness and ego death. Allowing people to experience sort of the illusory nature of the self has a lot of philosophical and spiritual implications without necessarily having to divulge in pseudoscience or mysticism.
Mm-hmm. So just in regards to the kind of, I think there's something that you just said there, which maybe kind of come up with like the free will sort of suggestion. Is that something? Do you sort of, just to broach that topic? Are you sort of a believer of that we have free will, or do you see it as just like causal effects of?
I'm very much a hard determinist. I don't believe that free will is anything more than wishful thinking. I don't necessarily assert that I am absolutely 100% right on that, because I'm hardly an expert, but as far as I can tell, human beings seem to very much just be driven by cause and effect.
Yeah, it's a funny one. I would completely agree with that, but I find that's quite a controversial viewpoint. Again, I think it's because I do hang out a lot in these very sort of traditional medicine circles and stuff like that, and the sort of, this is like certainly like the big clash of the moment. What I'm seeing is like the kind of the more spiritual sort of people want to believe that we are completely have free will, and I'm sort of the opposite thought. But I'm actually seeing like a lot of beauty in, and kind of I don't think it clashes with the spiritual element either. Just to be the wave radiating out from whatever point on the ocean. I think there's a lot of kind of a beauty in there, but then I will often then get sort of shouted, oh, that should just be materialist or reductionist or whatever, which is a bit weird because I think I'm probably more of a hippie than most people. But
yeah, I've gotten into this debate so many times with people that I've kind of stopped bothering with it and allow people to agree to disagree. But I do not personally believe in free will. I think I have a bit of a unique experience with the nature of free will, because I've had very high level depersonalization since around the age of 14, and I don't personally even feel the illusion of free will when I engage with my external environment. I very much feel like I don't have a sense of self, and that I'm a walking electrochemical machine responding to sensory input with pre-programmed responses. And I have had moments during my life where I have felt that sense of free will, where I feel like I'm a separate ego approaching an external environment, and I'm moving around my body through the power of agency. But I don't have that experience in my day-to-day life at all, and that's very much led me to believe that free will just doesn't exist.
So I'm almost the opposite. My logic tells me that it doesn't, but my experience sort of tells me that it does. Like it's very hard to sort of think, okay, I'm to not think that I'm choosing to do this with my fingers now. And I think, well, of course I am, because I'm doing it. And I think that's the kind of the argument that anybody would put forward. I could do this, so I could do that. But then I sort of realized, well, logically, no, I could only do what I did, and that's the only way of doing it. And it's
Yeah.
a bit of a head fuck.
Yeah, I can try to feel like I'm moving my hand in front of my face, but it just feels like a pre-programmed response, and it has done since around the age of 14.
Is that something that you sort of you could go into, like what? Do you mind if I ask you like what happened around the age of 14?
I don't actually know. I just had depersonalization set in as a teenager. I started realizing that I don't feel like myself anymore, and that I don't feel like I have a sense of self. Then around the age of maybe 17 to 18, I started experimenting with psychedelics, and my sense of self came back. I very much felt that I was a person that existed in the wild. And then eventually, over the course of around 2 years, that just faded. And often when I describe that to people, they think that I must be very, very depressed and dysfunctional, but I'm really not. At least not at this point.
I'm convinced. I'm convinced, Josie. But how did that? Can I just ask, how did that feel then? So you say you kind of you lost this sense of that, but then it reformed again when you were sort of 18. So was that a good thing or a bad thing?
At the time, it felt like a good thing for sure, and I imagine it probably was a good thing. My sense of self and my sense of agency reformed in a very specific moment on a very specific trip. I was sitting on a hill somewhere in London watching the sunset while tripping on LSD, and suddenly I just realized that I was me and I exist. And from that point forward, I regained my sense of self and agency. But then around the age of 20 to 21, it just started fading again.
I think that's the first person. The first time I've ever heard of was like someone taking psychedelics and having like a reverse ego death, like sort of like you got so high the self reformed itself together.
Essentially, I tripped myself sober.
and so that state lasted until the present, is it? Or
no, it lasted for about 3 years. So I recall in great detail what it feels like to have a sense of self or to be neurotypical in regards to having a sense of agency and free will. I know what that feels like, but I don't have it anymore. Maybe it'll come back someday, who knows?
And so, I mean, have you ever then had like an ego death experience while tripping? And is that then is that then seen as, do you see that as something good then to revert back to that selfless moment? Or?
So I think I experience ego death a little differently than the majority of the population. So for me, when I go through ego death, there isn't a feeling that I'm losing my sense of self because I didn't have a sense of self in the first place. What typically ends up disappearing is my ability to recall and comprehend basic details such as my name, who I am, what existence is, things like that. That actually resulted in some biases being implemented into the subjective affect index for a few years, which I've since cleared up. For a long time, I thought the ego death was purely a result of long-term memory suppression, but I have since rearranged how those subjective affect components work.
And what would you sort of class it as now then? How?
I would.
Because I think that in itself is quite a broad topic, and I think a lot of people you throw around the term sort of ego death, and I think it gets used a lot just in place of I was incredibly high.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
What would be your own sort of take on what constitutes an ego death?
So, ego death has an incredibly vague definition, and it's also used colloquially to refer to almost any high-level state. Generally speaking, it's a loss of one's sense of self while still remaining fully conscious during some kind of a hallucinogenic experience. It's often also used to refer to states of unity, which is less so when your sense of self has disappeared and more so when it's being applied to a greater amount of concepts and systems than it previously was. So in regards to ego death now, we have a number of subcategories for different types of ego death within the subjective affect index.
And so what kind of spectrum would that go across then? How many sort of categorizations would you put within that one thing? Because most people tend to think of it as like one thing, that when you have that feeling of sort of oneness of, yeah, I am just completely stripped away of all my meanness. I am no longer Rob, as it were. But you would say that there's a few different sort of slices within that?
There's a few different things that can cause it, for sure. For example, it can be caused by sensory overload. When you're experiencing so many sensory effects from a psychedelic experience that your brain's ability to allocate resources to maintaining a stable sense of self just completely breaks down. It can also be caused by long-term memory suppression. For example, when your long-term memory becomes so dysfunctional that you literally cannot recall who you are or what anything is, that can also result in ego death. It can also be caused by states of dissociation, at least specifically under the influence of dissociatives. So there's a number of different routes in which the brain can lead into ego death.
Where do you sort of have you done your sort of research on those? Because I imagine those are some pretty extreme states that you'd have to get into to be able to sort of come up with that kind of catalogue that you've done. Is that just from putting the feelers out there across the internet, or is this from personal experience that you like? I guess what I'm getting at is, have you deliberately tried to get yourself into these very sort of far out states?
Yes, absolutely. I used to be very passionate about documenting specific psychedelics, and I would always feel that I couldn't fully document the full spectrum of subjective effects that it was capable of inducing unless I got to an ego death state, which has resulted in some kind of reckless behavior at various points in my life. But yeah, ego death would always be the state that I would aim for.
That's right. You're very brave then, because I mean, it's not always a sort of a pleasant experience to get to that. I mean, I think it's for a lot of people it can be incredibly destabilizing. It can be incredibly blissful as well, but it's I always try and talk people down from seeing ego death as this kind of psychedelic end game, this kind of like the be all and end all, because it's.
I would agree.
The number of times I've been on like retreats with people and on the first night you go around the room and people say, what's your intention here? And people say ego death, and it's like it's just this thing that's put on a pedestal as the thing to aim for. But yeah, without fully realizing just how much it can just pull the rug out from underneath you.
I would absolutely agree. I'm not sure that going through ego death always induces the optimum amount of therapeutic and introspective thought patterns in comparison to something that's a little lower level, especially for people that aren't particularly experienced. I tend to be a lot more cautious these days, but typically when I'm going through ego death, even if I end up having a bad experience and freaking out internally, I have a profoundly strong instinct to just assume the fetal position and remain very still until I sober up, so that I do not interact with my external environment and cause any problems for myself later down the line.
And how about the kind of the mystical experiences? Is that something that you sort of experienced? Because I see them as a kind of an even sort of smaller niche. I think out of the number of sort of trips that I've done, I think the ones that I've had been this truly sort of mystical, where, you know, again, you'd have to go very much into the woo-woo language of divine, sacred, that sort of thing. But that seems to me like it is its own sort of subset, sort of category. It's got its own sort of uniqueness to it. Would you kind of agree there, or had you had those kind of experiences?
Yes, I've absolutely had those sorts of experiences, and those are the experiences that have kept me most fascinated with psychedelics over the years, much more so than, for example, visual effects or hallucinations or anything. I originally started taking psychedelics for the pretty colors and such, but I stuck around for the profoundly spiritual and transpersonal states. I'm particularly fascinated with a state that I refer to as unity and interconnectedness. I've always wanted to figure out or correlate the triggers that can result in people experiencing that subjective effect, because it seems to be so hard to pin down and so random at times that I feel if the triggers could be identified, that it would have a pretty profound impact on society.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think when you get into one of those states, it is such a desirable state to be in that you kind of, you recognize the sort of like the wanting to be there, but it does seem incredibly elusive to be able to get there. Like I've done low doses, high doses, all these different kind of psychedelics, and I've not been able to find any kind of correlating factor as to why it was triggered on any one particular occasion. Like on one time it's happened on NN-DMT, another time it's happened on ayahuasca, another time on mushrooms, and it just, yeah, I've no idea what the factor is, but when you sort of have it, it's like I think these are the ones where typically people say these are the most significant experiences of my life.
Yes, absolutely. I spent a long period of time trying to identify what causes people to experience a high-level state of unity and interconnectedness, that stereotypical state where they feel that they have become the universe experiencing itself through the particular point in space and time that their biological body happens to currently reside. And for years, I would watch my friends undergo these experiences. I even got to a point where I could with some reliability, induce it within people by essentially allowing them to come to a realization through a conversation while they were in a particular state. But I never experienced it for myself. And I came to the conclusion at the time that the fact that I was so fascinated by this state, the philosophies that surrounded it, and just experiencing it for myself was preventing me from undergoing it. But then one day, it just randomly happened. And then it happened on my next trip too, and the trip after that. But then it didn't happen again for another 5 to 6 years. Yeah. And I assumed that it would perhaps never happen again in my life. But then when I was tripping on 4-home-met of all substances back in 2018, I once again found myself going through a state of high-level unity. And those experiences have been by far the most profound experiences of my life, and an absolutely huge motivating factor for the Subjective Effect Index project as a whole.
Yeah. I mean, when I had those experiences, I was just a complete skeptic and just had no idea that like such an experience was possible. And then when I sort of came out of it, I was like, okay, well, shit, now I've got to reassess my entire brain. Like, what does this mean for who I thought I was? And yeah, it was similar to yourself. I kind of was desiring to be back in that sort of in that space, but yeah, for no matter sort of like how much ayahuasca I drank, or how much meditation I did or whatever, it just cannot. I cannot find a way to sort of trigger it. But I'm interested. You said you triggered it in other people by a certain sort of conversational cues. What kind of things would you say to people?
So I've managed to do it a few times. I'm not going to claim that I can do it consistently or anything. It seems to have to be somewhat of an organic experience. But essentially, while somebody is in a high-level state on the verge of ego death, there are certain times where if you can start engaging them in conversation regarding topics about the illusory nature of the self and the interconnected nature of reality, if you do it in the right way, you can kind of lead them to a realization where suddenly something clicks and they start experiencing high-level unity and maybe even start like breaking down and crying, like tears of cathartic joy. And it's I've seen it happen a few times, and it's interesting because it suggests to me that there may be some kind of process that could be developed, but something also tells me that the more you try to pin it down, the more it will elude people. So yeah,
I wonder if it's like a narrative kind of process, or whether because yeah. I mean the thing that jumps out to me is that I think there is. I think it's uncontroversial to say that like music and stuff has a really big factor on the outcome of a trip. And certainly from my experiences in South America, when you're in with these sort of traditional shamans doing their own sort of singing their own psychedelic language, that has its own sort of character, which is very unique within a trip. And I guess what you're kind of saying there is that there is a linguistic set of cues, just like there's a musical set of cues, which could also then sort of trigger that take someone down that kind of path.
I mean, I suspect that potentially is. It's something that it's probably a pipe dream, but it's something that I've always wanted to be able to specifically identify on a more formal level.
Yeah, it'd be interesting one to explore. I mean, I'm sure that I'm sure it's something similar to what what's happening in psychoanalysis. You are through sort of vocal cues. You are taking someone through this kind of inner journey and unlocking certain sort of emotions, and that's just happening just through pure conversation. So I think, yeah, it would make sense that something similar would be possible while someone's in one of these altered states, just by providing the sort of vocal cues. And I guess the skill there would just be in matching the cues to the person, sort of being able to read the moment. So, go on, sorry, is there anything you wanted to say on that?
No, I was just saying that sounds about right, and I'm gonna have to give us a lot of further thought. But it's something that's been stewing in my brain for years now, and I haven't come to any specific conclusions, even though it's something that I ponder a lot. So I don't have a great deal more to add on that topic.
Yeah, no worries. So I just want to sort of in sort of wrapping up. What's kind of like, would you say is your favourite substances of the psychedelics? Do you have a particular one, or are they kind of all equal tools in the toolbox for you?
That's a really tough choice. I've tried over 120 different individual compounds, and
Holy shit.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. It really depends on the context. I see them more as like, it feels like having a favorite tool in the toolbox. So for a given situation, I may prefer a particular psychedelic, and given another situation, I may prefer another psychedelic. But ayahuasca is a favorite of mine. LSD, 2CB, 4-ASO-DMT, psilocybin mushrooms. I'm actually a big fan of DXM, which sometimes surprises people since that's literally just cough syrup. But I find that I have profound spiritual experiences on that in a very reliable manner that often confuses me, considering it's $5 from Walgreens.
So do you take it literally as a cough syrup, or is there some way of extracting it, or?
Tend to do it in cough gels, but it's a dissociative hallucinogen, and I'd say it's 2/3 dissociative, 1/3 psychedelic, and that can consistently induce very profound experiences for me. But I seem to be an outlier that responds to that substance in a much more positive way than the vast majority of the population, and I'm not sure why that is. My enzymes seem quite geared up for metabolizing it.
Well, you've probably got something in common with my wife there, because she just kind of discovered the joys of DXM. She had a cough and she got some of the cough syrup, and she must be incredibly sensitive to it, because she was tripping like absolute face off on quite a I think only like a couple of spoonfuls. She wasn't even trying to get high on it. And she reported just like you, like it was a very pleasant and sort of profound experience. And I think it's one of those ones where it generally gets looked down on because of the kind of the cough syrupiness. People kind of like sneer a little
the connotations.
Bit of it. Yeah, and I must admit, I was kind of a bit like, really? You got high on cough syrup? And she was like, no, it's amazing. You got to try it. So maybe I need to check it out.
It's very specific to the person's metabolism. 1 in 10 people do not have the enzymes necessary to metabolize DXM and end up at a point where they have absolutely horrible side effects, and it can last up to 2 days for them. So it's kind of like Russian roulette if you're trying it for the first time, essentially. And it seems to be so incredibly variable between people, much more so than any other hallucinogen I've encountered, which I think is why it has kind of a reputation, kind of the reputation that it does.
And is it
but if it works for you, it's up there with the rest of them.
Okay, well, I think maybe to put my biases aside and give it a whirl then. And is it a hallucinogenic at sort of a normal dose, or do you have to do quite excessive amounts for it to get that effect?
It's definitely not a hallucinogen at a prescribed doses that it would recommend on the bottle, but doses of around 300 to 700 mg tend to induce an experience that is similar to a K-hole with a much more psychedelic skew.
Okay. And about it, 5-MeO DMT, have you tried that one?
Yes, I have tried 5-MeO DMT, and that's perhaps the only psychedelic that I've never been able to bring myself to ego death on, because it's so overwhelmingly physically uncomfortable that it essentially hurt.
Really?
It caused me physical pain to smoke. I mean, at least at heavier doses. I enjoyed it, but it would result in every single nerve ending across my body lighting up and becoming incredibly oversensitive, to the point that I felt that I couldn't push it. I couldn't push it to states of ego death because it was too physically uncomfortable. I couldn't withstand it.
Was that the synthetic version or the blue Farberis?
The synthetic version, yeah.
All right,
It was still
interesting.
it was still a very interesting experience, but it was so overwhelmingly tactile that it was uncomfortable at heavier dosages for sure.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was with my sort of experiences with that. It's one of the, I definitely got more of a body load from it than I do from sort of like regular DMT, but not quite what you described with this kind of sensory overload. It was more just sort of, yeah, it was kind of a few sort of waves of nausea to it as I was coming round, and just a bit more of a physical funk to it, but yeah, an incredibly sort of unique experience. It's yeah, I think it's I mean it's the one I think that's getting the most hype at the moment. I think it's the psychedelics tend to go through various trends of people saying like this is like the strongest one ever, the best one ever, and I feel that sort of 5-MeO has been a bit overblown at the moment with people sort of reading sort of very far into it, the kind of the unity element, and I certainly felt that from it. I think it's a very interesting experience, but I just see it as another experience among many.
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I think 5-MeO DMT is an important substance, but I don't think it's any more important than the range of other psychedelic substances that are available to us.
Yeah, I think it's put on a bit of a kind of a pedestal, and I think I'm not sure whether that's just because people are always looking for the next biggest thing, or just because it's being championed by certain sort of gurus that.
Yeah, I feel that DMT is also put on that pedestal to a pretty large extent. Like for the past several years, I've always been a proponent that DMT is actually an excellent starter psychedelic if you just give it to people at lower dosage ranges, because it allows them to have a psychedelic experience that lasts 5 minutes, and they don't necessarily have to ego death or break through or anything like that. But it's definitely given sort of a perspective, or that it's all or nothing with DMT, and I think that might be to its detriment.
Yeah, and with DMT, I would kind of agree with that, because I think you can give it to someone, and within that 5 minutes, that person will completely get what you mean by a psychedelic experience. Like that you've had the experience of being wet. Now you've had the experience of psychedelics. You know it now. Whereas if something like mushrooms, then you can just end up with a giggly experience, or there's so much variability there that you can end up with a trippy experience. But I think with DMT, you can end up with like even if you don't have the breakthrough experience, you still have the transforming geometry, pouring out the ceiling kind of experience, and this incredible sort of phasing of objects back and forth. So it's like, oh right, yeah, no, I think I understand what people are talking about when they use the word psychedelics. So I think in that way, it is a good sort of starting block. But
it's certainly much less of a commitment, and there's much less of a risk if you're introducing someone to psychedelics via a low dose of DMT. They can have the full spectrum of effects. They're in and they're out. There's absolutely no commitment. If you give somebody LSD for their first time and they start having a bad experience, that's it. They're stuck in that for the next 12 hours.
Yeah, and I don't think I've never seen anybody have like a. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but I've never seen anybody have like a bad experience on DMT in the same way that I've seen people have a bad experience on LSD. Because as you mentioned, if you have that bad experience on LSD, you are in it for you've got a good few hours ahead of you of introspective hell. Whereas like DMT, you can be out of it in a few minutes and at least like go, yeah, okay, that's not for me, and never touch it again.
Yeah, there's not really enough time to start slipping into incredibly complicated delusions and psychosis when it only lasts 5 minutes.
Well, I think I like with DMT is just that it's just so awesome. I mean, there's just so much kind of, well, yeah, I can't even think of another word to describe, just awesomeness. Just whenever I think like life is just getting on my tits, and it's sort of, work's bugging me, or I just realised I'm just in a bit of a funk. You could just be instantly reminded of just this world of pure joy and cartoon sort of happy. It's not like Adventure Time in smokable form, basically.
I've found it very useful. I've actually used DMT to calm down before when I've been feeling anxious, or if something is causing me a lot of distress, I'll just smoke a small amount of DMT, and immediately I'll have rational, introspective thoughts, and I'll come to a much less biased understanding of the situation that I'm actually in.
It's interesting because people often I mean, I certainly get it as well, that the anxiety you feel before taking DMT. Do you not suffer from that as much?
I don't personally suffer from anxiety before doing DMT. I've always found DMT to be very easy going. I find weed more difficult to handle than I do DMT. Which
I can't handle weed at all. Yeah, I have. My last experience on weed was an absolute nightmare, so I'm just never touching the stuff again. But I'm jealous. Yeah. I wish I didn't have those kind of the pre-flight jitters from DMT. That's I think I would have just spared myself a lot of adrenaline and anxiety if I could have your mindset there. Is there any particular tip that you could share, or
I don't know if there is. I suspect I probably am just wired. It's amazing what people can become desensitized to.
Mm-hmm.
I have been through prolonged periods of just absolutely binging, not necessarily in a healthy way, on psychedelic substances, and I think I've just sort of become desensitized to it. And DMT has always felt incredibly easygoing. It's always felt very calming, and that might be a thing that's unique to my specific neurochemistry, rather than something that I can suggest other people get into the mindset of.
So there you go, kids. So you've heard it there from Josie Kinz. The key to DMT anxiety is more DMT, more frequency.
It's a bit of practice.
Yeah, well, I keep having that mindset myself, thinking if I need to just power through and do this, and sometimes, I mean, plenty of times I do, but I always get that feeling in my stomach where it's like, oh God, do I really want to do this? And as soon as I've done it, I'm like, of course I wanted to do this. This was the best thing ever. But yeah, I could definitely do without all that anxiety at the beginning. So anyways, I think it's probably like a good place to sort of wrap up, Josie. But just before we sort of do, is there any sort of where would people, which of your many projects would you point people towards if they wanted to find sort of more about your work or yourself?
Well, if people are interested in the subjective effect index and reading all the documentation that's been laid out, I would recommend going on effectindex.com. If people are interested in replications, the subreddit R Replications is a good one for that, and also my YouTube channel, but I only have a few videos up, although I intend to keep churning those out.
And they are very good videos. I would definitely recommend them. So
thank you, I appreciate that.
But I'll put some links in the description below for people to be able to check those out. And yeah, I would recommend going and checking out all those things. The Replication subreddit is such a great sort of community, and yeah, for anyone who's interested in psychedelia, just to see the art these people have created is it's well worth a few minutes. So yeah, I think that's a good place to leave it there. Thanks a lot for your time, Josie.
Yeah, no problem. It's been great talking, Rob.
Yeah, likewise.